how do you view God? And if you were to draw out the mental representation, an image that you have of God, what would you draw? I wanted to show you some drawings from a case study that's called the Case of Olav, the Persecuting God and the Crucified Self. And I want you to pay attention to how these drawings actually symbolize and signal and really just describes the way that Olav thinks about God. And ask yourself, is this the way that I consider God? Or how would I draw out God? Okay, so this is one of the drawings. And Olav thought about God as the committee of eyes, essentially, that's observing him and really causing him to have perfectionistic patterns and maladaptive patterns of psychological functioning. So this eye keeps repeating itself in his drawings. You can even see it here with 5 eyes. And there's also 5 family members of his from growing up. And he viewed himself as the crucified self. Now, mind you, this is literally, I believe, a middle-aged man drawing these out. And this is how he viewed God. And here he sees himself as in a cage. So this was a relationship that he manifested in the physical through art therapy, going along and letting these drawings evolve over time. And I'm gonna share all this with you. And I also want to add below the case study in case anyone wants to read it. It's very interesting. For now, this journey that we'll go on right now is one where we'll talk about the face of the divine, the way that we represent God in our minds and how that can illustrate also a struggle and a tension between the self and God, that there's a struggle there with the God image and the self, and that image can evolve. So I want to start off with asking you this question. How do your internal struggle shape your image of God? How do your experience of life shape how you view God? Just sit with that for a moment and ask yourself if that's changed over time. Because right now, I thought we'd unpack the psychological dynamics that inform our faith journey. And to begin, I wanted to also just mention briefly the kind of program that was run here in Norway that was called the VITA program, that was essentially a model of a program. VITA, I believe in Latin, is life, and it stood for Vital Interpersonal Therapeutic Alliance, and it's a structured therapeutic program designed to address religious and existential concerns and issues that are intertwined with psychological distress, psychological maladaption, essentially. And this one illustrates psychodynamic theory, existential philosophy, as well as affect theory to help individuals, to help a person like Olav to transform rigid self-concepts and maladaptive God images and interpersonal dynamics. So there's a bunch of theories there combined that they put together to be able to have someone evolve in their God image and how it related to and relates to themselves. So I'm going to talk a bit about the VITA program. It's very, very interesting. And then towards the end, I'll also go into the case of Olav and give you an insight into his starting point, let's say, when he came to therapy, and then all the way to the transformation. So his current and desired outcome, let's say, and eventual outcome, and the transformative power of these types of programs that doesn't just look at an individual from the point of view of, oh, this is just a person with a psychological issue, and we're not going to even pay attention to or look at their their God image representation and how that relates to themselves. This model is able to do all of that together and really honor the way that God images can shape us and the way we view ourselves. So just practically, the VITA program was a 12-week program that spans over that time, offering a safe and supportive environment for exploration and transformation when it relates to these topics. And this program and the psychologists and everything that worked in this program had a clear distinction here and made sure that there was a clear distinction maintained between psychotherapy and pastoral counseling, which are different paths altogether, to avoid kind of influencing religious beliefs directly necessarily. So a lot of the people that came into the program, they had distorted religious images or representations essentially, and this was not a program to convert anyone, but rather to work with their psychological images of God and how it related to self. So how did they do that? Well, it's interesting. Group therapy, narrative work, art therapy, they used meditation and mindfulness, psychoeducation, etc. And first, with regard to group therapy, that encouraged sharing and exploring emotions, beliefs, relational dynamics, and so forth and so on. So they were encouraged to do that, which is not that normal in traditional, just normal therapy per se, to the same extent, or it's not as emphasized maybe, one's faith. Then narrative work. Narrative meaning everyone has got a narrative of themselves, of their stories, of how their life has evolved over time, and they have a narrative when it comes to also God. And participants here in this program, they were enabled and invited to sort of like rewrite their life stories and explore how personal and relational histories shape their beliefs and self-concept. So that was also emphasized here. Another thing that I just, mentioned when I introduced this was that they did art therapy. They painted, they drew, they expressed themselves. They expressed their images, their internal images onto paper through therapy. So it was a form of creative expression, drawing God images, drawing parents, drawing self, drawing family, just getting what's in here out on paper. And the purpose for that is to uncover unconscious emotional patterns that one might have. Then also meditation and mindfulness. So this was something that they engaged in to be able to, observe one's thoughts. It helps participants to process their emotions, because obviously with this type of therapy, it can trigger emotions. And in mindfulness, the whole practice is to be able to observe those as mere thoughts passing by like clouds, and to be able to get to the underlying meaning and purpose for it and the underlying emotions, and develop emotional resilience ultimately, to be able to have a gap between the thoughts to act from a responsible place. And psychoeducation also. So this VITA program enabled these people to have education, provided them insight into psychological mechanisms of guilt, shame, of defense mechanisms, etc., that they were coping with in each in their own way. And some of them might coped with it through having these, very maladaptive God images as well. So that's emphasized too. The VITA program also focused on affect differentiation. What does that mean? Affect is essentially, emotions in a way. So participants learn to identify, tolerate, and express a range of emotions, and that included suppressed or repressed, so conscious or unconscious feelings like anger, sadness, and tenderness. And very often, if we don't have the affect differentiation there, if we don't have the affect capacity to observe our emotions, then we're going to act from unprocessed emotions. We're going to understand God from a perspective that's very unprocessed, and it's just like a lot of projections there, because we don't see the connection points of why we believe what we believe. We haven't contemplated on it yet, and we haven't gotten in touch with the underlying emotions there. A lot of people might have shame or guilt or anger, and thus they think of God as the same as they feel themselves. So I'm going to move on into one more thing here. Boundaries and inclusion criteria. That's important to mention, because in these types of kind of gatherings, let's say, or in this therapy, they excluded certain people with certain kinds of mental dysfunction, psychological dysfunctions, such as those who had attempted suicide, had acute psychosis, or destructive impulsivity, and that was to ensure the safety and focus of the group. And participants must have religious or existential concerns tied to psychological distress. That was kind of the criteria to join in. And just to move forward here into theoretical components of how the model, the VITA model, was put together and for what reason, and looking at the theories, let's say, that founded the program, or was the foundation of the program. Exploration of inner representations was one. Attachment theory, they included kind of that. Affect theory, meta-reflection, mentalization, existential and narrative focus, and symbolic interpretation. So moving through that, first, exploration of inner representations. So based on object relations theory, the model focused on transforming harsh images of God that's like punitive or judgmental into benevolent representations that support self-cohesion and autonomy. So that's exploration of inner representation. Attachment theory, so builds on compensation hypothesis, right? Individuals with insecure attachments, they may see God as a surrogate figure. And so therapy in the VITA model really addressed this by fostering secure attachments and resilience through the group and through the therapist, him or herself, being secure in the way that he or she interacted with the participants. And then next, affect theory. So participants are again taught to differentiate between the different affects, the different emotions, core affects like anger, sadness, joy, from inhibitory feelings, which are shame and guilt and anxiety, to be able to reduce defensive patterns. Also, what is meta-reflection? If you look at the study, you'll see that they were engaged a lot in meta-reflection and mentalization, which encourages self-reflection on emotions through like journaling or things like that, on emotions, beliefs, and relationships, enhancing mentalization capacity, the ability to distinguish between internal states and external reality, being able to understand that even though that they feel something doesn't mean it's actually in reality true, even though that they think something, it doesn't mean that everyone else thinks that. That's the sort of mentalization process there, being able to discern that. And also it had an existential and narrative focus that, like I mentioned, it was inspired by existential psychotherapy, where the model helps participants confront existential guilt, loss of freedom, and moving from rigid beliefs toward a more flexible and adaptive worldview. And then lastly, symbolic interpretations. And this draws on a psychologist named Ricoeur's hermeneutic model, encouraging participants then to reinterpret religious symbols and narratives, moving from a rigid first naivete to a second naivete. So essentially the symbols of like the eye or the cross or anything at all that's religious symbols, they would work with that and look at how those drawings, let's say, even changed, or how they related to the symbols differently throughout the therapy. So now we can move on into the case a little bit, and it's super interesting. So Olav's case, I want to just apply a few different theories here to interpret his case. And to begin, let's introduce Olav. Olav was then a 35-year-old divorced lawyer. So he had climbed the ladder, become a lawyer, and he presented with quite a few psychological forms of distress, severe depression. He had this kind of, how do I say, this kind of psychotic episode pattern as well, and suicidal behavior at times, and also intense religious pathology. Funny word, pathology. And his symptoms included, well, like I mentioned, he perceived God as like a committee. He had a harsh internal committee representing God, his father, and others that then perpetuated guilt, shame, and self-condemnation. He also held quite a bit of survivor guilt because he had a twin brother that passed away and died. And so he held that guilt there in his heart and in his mind. Also, he presented with a strict religious upbringing. So he grew up in a religious home, emphasizing perfectionism and suppressing emotions. That's so unfortunate that is there, and that religious families can become perfectionistic and not be a source of love and home and protection and all these things. So he didn't experience that at all. In fact, he had a distant, demanding father, and he had a mother that abandoned the family, and very submissive mother as well. So that was how he experienced, or like that was how he came in, presented himself, or how the psychologist kind of was able to boil down his presenting symptoms, let's say. And the diagnosis he had included major depressive disorder, like I mentioned, with psychotic features. He had borderline personality disorder. He had narcissistic traits as well, a few of those, and defenses such as splitting, projection, and paranoid ideation that dominated his psychological functioning. And just to then take that and let's apply the theories here too. So we have Freudian's outlook, Freudian's theory, object relation theory, attachment theory, and those are essentially the ones that I'll go through. Okay, so with regard to the Freudian theory, Freud would interpret Olav's harsh committee, I guess, as a manifestation of the superego, and formed then through internalized parental expectations. The paternal imago that Freud really wrote a lot about, as in the father figure, the father imago, the paternal imago, shaped Olav's kind of punitive God image, projecting his father's perfectionism and emotional distance onto a divine figure, essentially. So Olav's identification with the crucified self, he identified himself with the crucified self like Christ, essentially. That aligns with Freud's concept of religion as an illusion and a defense mechanism. So in this case, it was actually a defense mechanism. And he unconsciously sought atonement for his guilt, survivor's guilt for his brother's death, through self-punishment and rigid adherence to religious ideals. So he kind of lived out his guilt in this way. He was able to deal with the guilt with the way that he thought about religion, that he was to be punished somehow for him surviving and his twin brother not surviving. And then there's the object relations theory. So Olav's God representation was rooted in early experiences with his emotionally distant father, like I mentioned, and the mother who was submissive. And these relationships led to a punitive and judgmental internalized God image, the way that he viewed his parents and got to know his parents. And his internal, like very like highly critical self-criticism reflected unresolved relational wounds, with God symbolizing the idealized but unattainable standards of his father, or set by his father, his earthly father, and then thinking that God would have the same standards like his father has, or that he would be, yeah, like an exalted version of his earthly father. So the therapy then focused on reconstructing these representations, these object relations, transforming the punitive God into a more benevolent figure who could affirm and support Olav's autonomy. Then looking at attachment theory. So Olav's insecure attachment to his parents obviously influenced his relationship with God. His ambivalent attachment to his father led to an over-dependence on the harsh committee that he had a mental representation of, mirroring his need for approval despite perpetual rejection, because he was just perpetually rejected in his life, he thought. And yeah, he thought that he was just rejected overall by this judge and this committee that was constantly like observing him. And then his avoidant attachment to his mother, because he had an avoidant attachment there because she was just like abandoning the family essentially, contributed to his difficulty expressing emotions and reliance on rigid religious practices for emotional regulation. In fact, he got divorced himself too, you know, just like his parents as well. And you can ponder and, you know, wonder if there's some relation there, where in his relationships to the woman in his life, he had this avoidance, was not able to express emotions. And lawyers too tend to be a lot in the head, typically speaking, because of the manner of work. And that could also be a form of, you know, if you dig a little bit deeper, it could be a form of like avoiding emotions overall and finding work that enable you to avoid those emotions, because then you'll just be living in your head and not in your body, not feeling into these emotions. The compensation hypothesis really here explains why Olav turned to God during crises as well, seeking a surrogate attachment figure to regulate distress. And then lastly, I'm going to mention some highlights in Olav's therapeutic process and like what contributed to that, to his growth and to his transformation, and say something about why that is. So first, exploration of shame and guilt. I'll talk about the transformation of God image, processing anger toward his father, emotional corrective experiences, art therapy, meta-reflection, mentalization, and why these highlights were transformative. Okay, so to begin with exploration of shame and guilt, Olav recognized how survivor's guilt linked to his twins' death and perfectionism, driven by his father's expectations, shaped his harsh self-criticism. And by differentiating between existential guilt, real guilt, and defensive guilt, Olav could then begin to release that kind of self-blame and embrace self-compassion, or compassion from the beyond, from God essentially. Because if you're experiencing self-compassion, it's oftentimes because, well, we have a limited self-compassion, but God has immense unconditional compassion for us at all times. But he needed to differentiate between these types of guilt to be able to, you know, function better, essentially. Also, the therapy really helped him to transform his God image. So through narrative work and art therapy, Olav really reinterpreted his punitive God as a benevolent, affirming figure. And this shift really allowed him to distance himself from this like committee and reclaiming his autonomy much more. And there were some symbolic actions in this study which I paid attention to, and especially the one where he would write on a cup, "You are Olav, you are allowed, or you have the right to be Olav." And this affirmed his individuality and his worth, that he didn't have to perform to be something else, that he was enough in a sense. Also, processing anger toward his father. He would like in this study, be processing that anger that he held for his father, and he got to confront that suppressed anger toward both his father and to God. A lot of the times, you see, if we don't confess these feelings, they're just gonna boil. They're just gonna stick there and grow like a rose bush, you know? And lots of weeds. It's gonna not look good at all eventually. And the best way to deal with that is to confess, to say, God, I confess, I feel X, Y, and Z. Or say, you don't even have to say God, okay? You can just talk with yourself then. Say, I admit and I confess that I feel X, Y, and Z. And just let that come up and come out. And through that process, you process your anger, and you actually, by doing that, create the emotional space for individuation, separating your sense of self from external judgments. And then also emotional corrective experiences was a thing in this therapy, and what really added value to his growth. So he participated in the group therapy, right? And that provided him validation and support, helping him to overcome his fear of rejection. And so it can for anyone else. When you attend a group setting, it can and should provide that in therapy. And he also experienced corrective emotional responses when therapists and peers accepted his vulnerabilities, enabling him to process his emotions more adaptively. So how those around you respond to your vulnerable expression and to your confession can have an impact on how you integrate that experience and form a new God image. Also, you have art therapy. So that, I believe, was a big move of this program, that they included that, because it's so transformative. It truly is. As a creative myself, I can truly say that. So I'll say a little bit more about art therapy. I believe that in this program, depictions of his father as a divided figure, smiling but yet furious, clarified the internal conflict between longing for intimacy and approval and fearing judgment and punishment from his dad. So by him drawing out how he viewed his dad, obviously that not only to the psychologists that viewed this and reviewed what he drew out, but even to himself, he got to see how he viewed his father, that it was split to some degree, right? And he also drew out himself as a crucified child, like I mentioned, several times over. And that symbolized his feelings of guilt and self-sacrifice, which he later then reinterpreted during therapy. Also, the meta-reflection and mentalization, like I've mentioned before, he developed the ability to reflect on his internal representations, then gaining insights into how his childhood shaped his beliefs and his behaviors. And this process somehow reduced this pattern that perfectionism tend to induce, which is black and white thinking, and it fostered a more nuanced understanding of relationships, of faith, and of self-worth. What a beautiful thing that the therapy could help him with that. So why were these highlights, transformative? Because of emotional validation, first and foremost. Olav's shame and guilt were acknowledged. They weren't suppressed or repressed or, just not paid attention to or ignored. They were lifted up and they were encouraged, reducing the power of the committee. That shows how powerful confession really is, which is a religious practice actually. Confession in prayer is definitely one of the most powerful ways to pray, including thanksgiving and supplication and adoration of God. Like all of that, it really reminds me of the Acts prayer: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. That all together really enables you to feel God's presence more lovingly. So confession is a big thing. Also, symbolic integration would be a highlight, because reinterpreting religious symbols and narratives allowed Olav to move from a rigid, punitive faith to a reflective maladaptive, personal faith. Second, naivete. So from just like not something personal to something personal to him. And individuation too. Processing anger towards his father and God enabled Olav to establish boundaries and a healthier sense of self as well. And of course, also supportive relationships. He got to experience that with the other people that attended the group. Group therapy provided a corrective experience of connection and belonging, countering his lifelong isolation that he had experienced. Because sometimes you can engage with people, but you're totally isolated actually, because you haven't authentically, confessed your feelings, your underlying experience, and so you have a surface level relationship. But if you're able to tap into that deeper place, that sacred place, and share from that place of vulnerability, that is the birthplace for belonging that Brené Brown, for instance, talks about a lot. So with this, Olav's journey really highlights the transformative power of programs such as the VITA model or the VITA program. And I think it really also highlights the transformative power of addressing psychological or psychodynamic conflicts that we might have, reconstructing God images and knowing that that's possible, and integrating suppressed emotions. So instead of having them be suppressed or repressed, but then allowing those to come up and to be reintegrated into its place so that you can feel more of God's love anew. The VITA model structured approach also facilitated, this wonderful Olav's growth and could for you too, allowing both him and you to emerge as autonomous, resilient individuals with a renewed sense of faith and purpose that's able to relate to everything and everyone differently after that. So I pray and I hope that this was interesting to you and that it gave you a little insight into what it could be like to reconstruct one's God image and how that can change and alter through group dynamics, through coming together, through confessing and sharing about one's journey, and through having and receiving supportive therapy that acknowledges your faith, that acknowledges your stand with God, the way that you view God, whether it be maladaptive or adaptive. And I really highly encourage that if you ever go to therapy and if you ever can consider this as something that you want to work on or important to work on, to be blunt about it and be like, this is an important part of my life. I'm gonna show up to therapy, but I'd love for this to be something that we can talk about in therapy. Even coming into the garden community that I host, that is welcome there. This is the purpose of the garden community. For anyone from any walk of life, any religious background or lack thereof, anyone on any spiritual journey is welcome, because through contemplation together, we can experience deeper connection to each other, to ourselves, to God, to the beyond, and we can begin contribute through such things as artful acts like Olav went through. And the whole concept is really the same as the VITA program inside of the garden as well. So if you're interested, go to the link below to join into the garden. I want to say, as of this time, I'm not a certified clinical psychologist, but I'm studying psychology and I am studying theology, and I'm interested in religion psychology, and I'm interested in the overlap of all of that, including art as well, how all that together can really support us in our psychological, mental well-being, as well as really acknowledging that, we're more than this up here. We have a soul, we have a spirit on a journey, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and create space for that to be explored. So thank you so much for joining in, and feel free to add your comments below and share your thoughts as well. And I hope to also see you inside of the garden.